Good morning. So yesterday morning, every Saturday morning I do a run with a group of guys, and I met a pig. This is a picture of me with the pig. Now, the pig would let me hold the pig, but let me get close enough to give the pig a hug. And then after I met the pig, I met a donkey. It's amazing what you can find on a Saturday morning. Cute donkey. I happened to find a little petting zoo in the middle of a park. I was looking for a lamb, didn't find a lamb, but I did find a goat. The fun thing about this goat is I had to pick up 3 or 4 to get one to actually let me hold it because they were scared of me. But I didn't find a lamb, which is unfortunate because after I delivered my first message about sheep being dumb, I was corrected by a former sheep farmer in our church who said, "Maybe you're the dumb one, Pastor, because sheep are smarter than you think." I appreciate correction. Thank you, Connie McFarland. I appreciate and love you very much. There's a lot to learn about sheep. So this is kind of a fun way of introducing to you the third week on our sermon series, the 23rd Psalm. And we're going to be looking at just one section, the heart. There's so much beauty and so much truth here in verse 4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. One more time. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. May God today bless us with the reading of this holy and sacred word. This is the beginning of a novel and a autobiography I read recently. It begins this way. It happened on December 30th, 2003. That seems like a very long time ago until it happens to you. And it will happen to you. The circumstances may be different from you than it was for me, but it will happen to you. And that's what I'm here to tell you. You'll see me in the grocery store, you'll see me speaking on a stage, or you may see me somewhere in the park. And you'll look at me and say, "It happened to her." But you can't bear the thought of thinking, it will happen to me. That's the opening words from a very beautiful and at the same time agonizing book written by Joan Didion, author, novelist, journalist. She was a part of the new journalism that began to take place in the 60s and 70s with people like Thomas Wolfe or Truman Capote or Hunter Thompson. It was a form of journalism where the journalists would immerse themselves in the story and they became a part of what they were reporting, a part of the narrative. Joan Didion was married to another author and a playwright named John Donne, who was also a well-known author. They had a strong 40-year marriage. And they were also literary partners and encouraged each other in their writing. One cold December day, they'd spent the entire day at the hospital near their home where they were there to take care of their daughter who was going through a severe medical crisis and who was in the ICU. Exhausted at the end of the day, they left the hospital and went to their home and lit a fire to warm their home and to warm their hearts. John mixed himself a drink and sat down at the table and began to read a book while Joan prepared dinner for them, and they were having a conversation about the events of the day when suddenly he went quiet. She turned and found him slumped over on the table. She said, "At first I thought he was kidding and joking, like you do with one another when you've had a long, exhausting day. I'm so tired, I think I'm going to die." So she found out he wasn't joking. She called the EMS, medical services. They came, they took him, they worked on him for 45 minutes and took him to the nearby hospital. And she said when she walked into the door of the emergency room, she was greeted by a social worker. And she said, "You should know that if you're ever greeted by a social worker and a chaplain, almost always the news isn't good." And it wasn't. Her beloved husband of 40 years had died. The book then, The Year of Magical Thinking is the title of the book, is about her year-long working through grief, her sorrow, and this valley of darkness that she walked through. And this is a quote from her on the back of your bulletin. I put it there for you. It says, "Life changes fast. Life changes in an instant. You sit down to dinner, and life as you know it ends. Grief turns out to be a place none of us know until we reach it." It's true. Now here in the Psalm 23, we move from the high warmth and love that we find at the beginning of the psalm, and the psalm takes a turn into a valley of deep darkness. Just like a shepherd would lead his sheep to green pastures and to still waters, at some point they would have to pass through these deep, dark caverns where they were subject to flash floods and predators and getting lost. You see, we move in the psalm from hearing about a shepherd that provides for our basic needs. We have no wants because the shepherd provides for us. He leads us to green pastures where we can rest. He leads us to still waters, restores us, brings us back to ourselves, and puts us back on the right path for His name's sake. And then, just like life, we find ourselves in the valley of the shadow of death. Now, most often, we associate this psalm with a funeral, or we associate this psalm with a graveside service, or we associate it as something that's read to someone at the bedside of someone who may be dying. But this is more than just a funeral psalm. The word death actually never appears in the Hebrew language. It is better translated as the valley of the deepest and deepest darkness. Now notice, will you, the wording that David uses in this psalm. Notice he doesn't say, "If I walk through the valley of the shadow." He says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow." And he's making the point here, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when and how and what it looks like. Because, like Gideon said, life is difficult. There are times when life is just absolutely, completely, almost unbearable. And so the psalm speaks to the truth of our human condition, that in every single person's ordinary, everyday life, there will be many seasons of darkness. Those moments when we're having chronic issues with our health and prolonged health troubles, or difficulties with depression that won't let go. When we're walking through a deep valley of anxiety over the world we're living in or our personal circumstances, and we can't sleep, and we can't see light, we can't see beyond what's right in front of us. When we experience relationship troubles and breakdowns and betrayals and hurt. When we walk through pain and difficulty, any kind of suffering, those are all valleys. We all walk through them. It's not a question of if, but when. Jim Gooch. I loved Jim Gooch. We called him the Gooch. He was one of those dependable men, an elder in my former church. At a church event, Gooch would be the first one to show up and help set up. At the end of the event, he'd be the last one to leave and to help with the cleanup. When there was a project to be done and we needed to raise money for it, Jim Gooch was the first one to show up and to write a check and to get on board with what we were trying to do. If you went into the hospital, most likely one of the first people who would walk into your door with a communion kit would be Gooch. You could depend on him. You could count on him. He was that kind of guy. One time, I ran down this long road out in the country and kept running. And kept running because I was lost. I was trying to find my way back to the way I started. After running 22 miles, I realized I'd run so far, I couldn't run back to where I wanted to get to because I didn't know how to find it anyway, but there wasn't another 22 miles in me. So what did I do? I called Gooch. Gooch knew where I was. Came immediately, picked me up, and laughed at me all the way home. One of the greatest honors and privileges of my life was to hold that sweet man's hand when he was dying. I held his hand. I told him I loved him. I knew I'd be doing his eulogy. And I said to him, Jim, what do you want me to say about your life that you're proud of? What do you want people to remember? And without hesitation, Jim said, tell them I was married to Barbara for 50 years, and I'm proud of it. And then he looked at me, he got a smile on his face, and he said, and you know it wasn't easy. You see, Barbara, like my mother, was a force of nature. And the reality is, anybody that stays married for a long time, there are a lot of people in this room who have been married to one another for a very, very long time, and you know that in every married life, there are ups and downs and valleys. When you think, are we going to be able to get through this? Is our love strong enough to get through this loss, this trouble, this heartbreak, this hardship? And for those of you in the room, and particularly in the early service, I said, expect it. If you're married, you're going to go through multiple dark valleys. It's a part of life. It's what grows our life. Here's the thing. This psalm does not sidestep hardship. And two things can be true at once. That's hard to hear. It's hard to walk through. But it's also good news. Because hardship and difficulties, as it says in Romans 5:1, produce endurance that develop character. And it's where we find hope. You see, two things happen in a dark valley. On the one hand, we lose perspective. Where am I? I don't know where I am. God, where are you? I can't see my way out of this. I don't know when this is going to end. There's so much uncertainty. We lose our perspective. But on the other hand, in the midst of the dark valley, we also gain perspective. Because it's in the darkness that we realize, this stuff I've been carrying, I don't need to carry this anymore. The unforgiveness, the resentment. In the darkness, we learn what is true and what is good and what is valuable, what we need to hold on to and what we need to let go of. Now, maybe on such a serious matter, talking about Baker Mayfield may be a bit trivial. But I don't think it is. Baker Mayfield, you know, because we're from Oklahoma, was the 2017 Heisman Trophy winner from OU. By the way, the first ever walk-on football player of any team to ever win the Heisman. Drafted in the first round by the Cleveland Browns, won the Rookie of the Year award, but unfortunately was more well known for his divisiveness in the locker room, his television commercials, which were pretty good, by the way, and for his immaturity and kind of, well, you know. They gave up on him after a year and a half, 2 years. And they traded the number one pick, Baker Mayfield, who was at the height, for a fifth-round pick. I think he went to the Panthers, then he went to the Rams. Everybody gave up on him. Everybody was negative on Baker. And then he landed, this person who was traded for landed the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where a former first-round pick, Heisman Trophy winner, had to compete with a second-tier quarterback for a starting job, and he won it. Now, if you talk to him, he's a different person. Having been traded, having been pushed from one team to another, having a little bit of humility added to his game. Now he talks about how much he learned, what he went through, how it changed him, how he's matured, how he says, I've learned a lot about what's important, what's not important. And as a result, what a fine young man who is now, because of what he went through, leading possibly the Buccaneers, maybe through an MVP season, into a Super Bowl. Now, this is a truth that no one wants to hear, but write it down because it's true. No one wants a dark valley, but everyone needs one to become who you're called to be. Now, I mentioned earlier that death is not mentioned in this psalm. It's not in the Hebrew text. But for some reason or other, in 1691, when the King James Version of the Bible was translated, they put in this phrase, the valley of the shadow of death. Some have suggested that they thought it was more evocative, more poetic. And there's a way to play with the words to make it say that. But I personally think that perhaps it was that in 1619, when the New Testament and the Old Testament were published in the King James Version, they were pretty well acquainted with death in that period in time. Death was more intimate, more personal, more close. War, disease, plague, on and on. And so it just described a shadow of death that hung over every person's life. I like that too. I think it's true. And I told my wife, I said, Teresa, I'm going to start my sermon on Sunday this way. What do you think? I'm going to walk up and the first words out of my mouth are going to be, well, everybody, you're going to die. And she said, that's not a good idea. It's not a way to win friends and influence people to say you're going to die. I said, well, it's true. She said, don't say it. There'll be kids in the room. You'll never get to be on a TED Talk if you say that. But the reality is, like I said before, two things can be true at once, right? Yes, that is news that is very difficult to hear. It's hard to hear that and to face our own mortality. But at the same time, the reason I was going to start that is because to know that we're mortal, to know that our life is limited, to know that our life has an end is a profound gift. Because when you know that life is limited, you know that life is sacred, that life is special. Life is meant to be lived to the fullest of our capacity. And when we know that our time is limited, we give our best to it. Or at least I hope we will. One of the most impactful novels that I've read was written by, and I'm probably pronouncing his name incorrectly, so forgive me. I'll put a quote on the back if you want to look it up. Paul Kalamathi. He was a neurosurgeon. To become a neurosurgeon, it's kind of like the superstars of the medical field. You got to go 15 years through residencies and medical school and college to become before you're allowed to be a neurosurgeon. And after becoming a neurosurgeon and one of the best in his field, he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. It metastasized to his bones and also to his brain. That reality for him, tragic, at the same time transformed the way that he viewed medicine and viewed his patients. The book, When Breath Becomes Air, is about his experiences that was published after he passed by his wife that he began to write. It changed the way that he thought about everything, how he viewed his marriage, how he viewed relationships. And that book has gone on to impact lots of people, myself included, but particularly people in the medical field, and what happens when a doctor becomes the patient. There's a quote I want to share with you. In it, the book he writes, I began to realize that coming into such close contact with my own mortality changed both nothing and everything. Before my career was diagnosed, I knew that someday I would die, but I didn't know when. After the diagnosis, I knew that someday I would die, but I didn't know when. But now I knew it acutely. The problem wasn't really a scientific one. The fact of death, he says, is unsettling. The fact of death is unsettling, yet there is no better way to live. Now, when faced with that reality, we got one of three responses, right? You can choose the path of self-indulgence. I'm going to die, so, in the words of the front man from the Doors, I woke up this morning and grabbed myself a beer. The future's uncertain, so that the end is always near. Let it roll, baby, roll. I like that song, by the way, Roadhouse Blues. But he didn't live past 27. The second is despair. Like Woody Allen said, what's the point of doing homework if you know you're going to die? Or the third is purpose. Meaningful purpose. Thinking about what matters and what doesn't matter and living intentionally a life of love and goodness. In the home that I grew up in, my parents were named Pat and Judy Emery. In that home, there were two subjects we never discussed: sex and death. We never talked about it. Two of the most important realities of life, sex and death, that was never discussed. I had to learn about those things on my own outside my home because we did not discuss them. Even in the loss of family members, we did not talk about death. Now, I don't fault my parents. I have wonderful parents. They were just kids when they had their kids, and they raised two adults that are healthy and good people that have healthy families and good marriages. One of their son became a pastor, and they were just beautiful people. I love my parents, but they just couldn't talk about it. From some early childhood trauma. And when my dad was dying in the last 4 or 5 years of his life, when we knew that my father was going to die because of the complications of his health that were worsening day by day, we were not able to talk about what was happening. Even to the very day that he died, on the day that the hospice nurse walked into the room and said to him, "Mr. Emery, they're going to die, and we need to move you to the hospice hospital." Even in that moment, because we weren't able to talk about it, and it broke my heart. It broke my heart because I missed out on a sacred moment between a father and son to talk about what was happening and to work as a pastor to be able to help my dad, but I could not talk about it. I couldn't talk about it. And I missed that moment. And I regret that. I missed that moment. Write this down. Don't forget this. This is true. Avoiding death, we avoid life. Avoiding death is avoiding life. Now notice what David says. He says, even though I walk. He doesn't say, even though I sat down, even though I pitched my tent. He says, I walked. And the reality is, in every season of darkness that we have, the temptation is to want to make it our home, to live there. Now, there are going to be times when we have to rest, and we need to rest and sit down and pace ourselves. But because of the good news of the gospel, what we're called to do is just to keep what you can't go back. We can't go back to where we started. We can't go back to what was. We just have to keep moving, and we're able to keep moving because of the hope we have in the gospel that says that death does not have the final word. that Jesus Christ, through his life and death, brought immortality to light. And this is the hope of the gospel, because it says in the text, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear that evil, because you are with me. Even if we can't talk about it, we have this assurance and this comfort and this belief that we can reach out our hand, and the one who intimately knows about life and death will hold us through it. I believe that to be true. I know that to be true. Because God became a human being. His Son, his very one and only Son, died a human death, was crucified and buried and dead. And 3 days later, that beloved, beautiful Son of God walked out of the grave. And to this very day, continues to walk into your valley and my valley and every valley to grab our hands. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, because you are with me. That's the good news of Jesus Christ, and if you were Pentecostals, you'd be jumping up and down right now.